Hello and welcome to the program. This is another podcast for The Diplomat. I am Luke Hunt and with me is Bradley Merg. Bradley is a Southeast Asian specialist, a quite senior academic with a wealth of knowledge about China and the region. Bradley, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're seeing a lot of change with COVID, the economies, China's attitude to Southeast Asia seems to be altering. I'm not too sure how big a shift it actually is. And in Cambodia, they've certainly left their mark. How do you see the region shaping up in 2021?
Well, with regard to the relationship with China, it's been already in January a relatively banner year for Beijing. Beijing kicked off with the announcement of a new white paper on Chinese aid policy, essentially responding to a significant amount of the critique that we've seen about the Belt and Road Initiative over the course of the last 2 years. A relatively frank paper about the future of that program, the future of Chinese aid in general, and remarkably a rather broad set of statements about the enormous amount of investment and time that Beijing will be putting into questions of health. COVID-19 is up for competition, and Beijing is clearly here to play.
And that's on the vaccine front.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even beyond in terms of really prioritizing building out health facilities, et cetera. It's Chinese aid we think of as infrastructure primarily, and China's really put a flag in the ground saying it's not just infrastructure anymore.
Yeah, there was some issues with the white paper. Perhaps you can help me to understand it a little bit, but there was one reference to what they're planning to do over the coming years, and one of them was to construct 100 happy campuses. What is a happy campus? Somewhere for the Uyghurs to live? I really, that one kind of floored me a little bit. Their choice, it's their language, it's the way they couch things.
It's a great question, and I think that's also one of the aspects of the paper as a whole. Is we see it's very long on very broad generalizations and very short on specifics.
Well, it kind of reads the way they used to read 20, 30 years ago, where full of grand language and kind of China out to save the world and everyone else is a victim unless we help them.
Precisely. We go in and it begins with the usual framing of the principles of peaceful coexistence and this very lengthy statement of China's deep role in South-South cooperation, essentially framing China as the leading state in South-South cooperation, and that this is fundamentally distinct from how aid normally works, that aid normally operates through North-South cooperation, but because Beijing is doing this differently, it consistently refers to itself, as it's done in the past, but so strongly here as a developing country, that it seems to continue to believe that it's able to sidestep basic best practice on how development is done and how foreign aid is provided.
Right. I was recently down in Sihanoukville and been travelling the country because, well, we can't leave the country.
Precisely.
A lot of people are catching up in Cambodia, that is, on going to ticking boxes and going to those places they hadn't been before. But the Chinese are noticeably absent. There's virtually no one in Sihanoukville. There was speculation that millions were going to be arriving late last year. Real estate agents have been told they could sell up to 2 million apartments to Chinese people looking to migrate, retire, bring their parents down. Embassies are saying that the number of Chinese heading this way was a lot higher. We haven't seen it. I mean, should Cambodians be braced for a massive influx? I mean, a lot of it does have to do with COVID, but how do you see it unfolding on the ground going forward?
Well, we had over the course of 2019 and 2020 two large waves of exodus of People's Republic of China citizens out of the kingdom. First of these we saw in August, September of 2019 when online gambling was finally shut down, and no one really, even analysts here on the ground, I think, were completely shocked at the sheer scale of that operation. At looking at places such as Bavet and Sihanoukville, where you couldn't get a flight out of Cambodia to China for weeks, seeing entire convoys of folks driving from the provincial city of Bavet near Vietnam to Phnom Penh to fly out. That was our first round. And then, of course, we also saw the departures as COVID began.
Right.
So at this stage, although it's possible to come back in the kingdom, it appeared that with revised business visas a few months ago, that this was designed especially to see Chinese investors return. But of course now with Cambodia's changed entry policy for mandatory 2-week quarantine for everyone, these folks simply aren't coming back. Everyone's waiting and holding out. But we shouldn't think of this as some sort of fundamental shift. This is definitely probably best viewed as a short-term blip that is increasingly just simply dependent upon the COVID-19 situation.
Right, and the Chinese embassy earlier this week announced that it's telling its citizens not to gamble in Cambodia, which would be a hell of a blow for the economy, or the planned economy, and what they've been, the infrastructure projects and what they're building, particularly down south.
In Sihanoukville was framed as it was supposed to be Cambodia's version of Shenzhen, and even when that shifted to, all right, this is going to be more tourism focused, it remained, gambling. Even though we're beginning to see the city build out, it doesn't feel as much like simply an entire construction site. At this point, we're seeing some projects finish. If you don't have Chinese citizens coming to Cambodia to gamble, that really makes Sihanoukville an enormous white elephant.
Particularly when there's a ban on Cambodia's gambling in their own casinos.
This is going. We still have the border casinos, which many Vietnamese frequent. But if we don't have the Chinese coming in, then the question really becomes: Sihanoukville has been fundamentally altered,
right.
And what's the future of it? Where is that? Cambodia does not have a huge amount of beach.
Right. The coastline's quite small.
Precisely, and Sihanoukville has become a place where two other groups simply don't go anymore. Khmers increasingly do not vacation in Sihanoukville. They go to Kampot or to Kep, where foreign tourists, particularly the sort of the eventual return of the sort of upper income family of four from Europe, which is the sort of idealized high-spending tourist, those folks aren't going to Sihanoukville.
How indicative is Sihanoukville in terms of the whole Belt and Road Initiative, in that it's basically stopped? There's enormous numbers of empty skyscrapers, skeletons, half-built buildings, that kind of thing. But there's been this enormous backlash around the planet to the Chinese, what they've been doing in countries from Sri Lanka to Africa to Fiji. Is the Belt and Road Initiative, is that starting to see some serious stumbling blocks, particularly in terms of China's grand plan of being a global power?
Everybody who's looking at BRI, regardless of whether they're in favor of it or they oppose it or take a completely neutral position, has recognized that the spending has slowed. The lending has significantly slowed down. On the one side, I think the most extreme approach I read was by a colleague who claimed that China was simply slowing down investment because there wasn't any more need for large-scale infrastructure investment,
right.
Which, as apologetics go, was about as extreme as you can get. A more realistic, I think, answer is Beijing has looked at and has suffered significantly from the fact that so many of these projects were mismanaged. And it was very unclear as to what precisely counted as a Belt and Road Initiative project.
Right.
There was no central list. One of the interesting things about their most recent white paper is we do have numbers, at least, and it's much clearer in terms of what is officially Belt and Road and what is not. But when we look at Sihanoukville, and we would see huge buildings opening up, and every third real estate firm saying we're building the BRI towers, we're part of BRI, which of course they weren't. But everyone jumped on the bandwagon of this huge initiative. So Sihanoukville became really the image of sort of BRI gone wrong. Not entirely because of the question of the specific aid that China provided for the construction of the port, but rather the sheer influx of investment and construction and individuals that the city itself and local governance were simply not able to keep up with.
Yeah, they struggled to cope.
Enormously.
Right. In the white paper itself, you were just saying that there seemed to be a bit more clarity on the numbers. What did you find most telling about the paper?
The most interesting aspect was the repetition, but the repetition in a somewhat frank manner of saying, yes, the future of BRI is better quality infrastructure.
Right.
With really frank statements about improving environmental standards, improving monitoring and evaluation, improving poverty assessment, and really beginning to take on board the mainstream concepts, at least stating that they're taking on board the mainstream concepts utilized in development. At the same time, it's also framed very much as being consistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals.
Right.
Here in Phnom Penh, we just had I believe it was yesterday or Thursday, the country representative for the United Nations Development Program made a very strong statement supporting China's aid and assistance as being fundamentally consistent with UN, with the SDGs.
Right.
So China's said, okay, we're on board, we're going to be doing this, we're going to be making these reforms. At the same time, however, it highlights that it's been engaging in training and capacity building of local officials to do better on implementation, on supporting environment, et cetera. But you have to start asking, if China itself admits that it has failed to adhere to these standards, how is it training local officials over the last 2 or 3 years to do what China itself has been unable to do?
Right.
China seems to need the training itself rather than to be going out and telling folks how to do development better when it just issued a paper saying, hey, we promise it's not going to be as bad as we move forward, we're working on it.
Okay. In terms of military strategy, the South China Sea, there's a lot of noise coming out of Washington in the final days of the Trump administration. I think most people suspect that will continue under Biden. The BRI seems to be inextricably linked to military strategy. Is that just something that's being conjured up by the West, or is it something that's very real that's coming out of China?
Well, you have, we think of here in Southeast Asia, we always think in our own regional context, obviously, and we are the sort of test lab for a lot of what China does. We've seen it through the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Mechanism, which, to be fair, has been much better implemented and much more consistent and predictable than BRI funding. I think that has to be recognized. It also was really the first place where we saw China expand into areas, education, et cetera, that it was not normally known for participating in. But BRI globally, particularly when we look at the new Silk Road, we look at the connections through Central Asia and Russia, building out those links, at the end of the day, there is, of course, a security aspect to it. There is one country that maintains naval supremacy in the South China Sea, and that country is the United States.
Right.
And that is the case for the foreseeable future. And although China has been investing and has been building up its military and its naval capacity for quite some time, working towards a blue water navy, even Beijing's own estimates are that it wouldn't really achieve parity with the U.S. till 2035, and the U.S. side has basically said, well, we don't even think that's remotely feasible till 2049, and here's another 64 new ships and continuing pivot to the Pacific.
Right.
So China's issue, of course, is that if the U.S. controls the South China Sea, the fundamental issue is the U.S. can blockade China. China needs particularly those land links through Central Asia.
And
through
the
Russia.
old string of pearls strategy, we used to call it 20 years ago.
And we've got on the naval side string of pearls, and we've got the new Silk Road, and of course all of this connecting to a whole series of economic corridors to facilitate greater Chinese integration with all of its neighbors.
And of course with COVID, this is all just basically falling apart.
Things have COVID has slowed things down considerably. By China to the fact that it was running before it could walk in terms of aid policy. Of course, we have gone through for the last few years the questions of debt traps. We've gone through the Sri Lanka port debacle, and we've seen other problems. But just earlier this month, Foreign Minister Wang Yi was doing his tour of Africa and signed up Botswana and the Democratic Republic of Congo as new members of BRI. So it does continue, although there is the COVID issue is inherently going to slow anything because you're simply not getting the ability to move. And we're looking at a completely different supply chain world after this is over.
Taking it back to where we started, actually, it's the foreign minister's trip to Myanmar, Philippines, and the whole vaccine diplomacy. It's quite remarkable. I mean, the Chinese vaccines don't have the efficiency rate that other vaccines are coming out with. The rollout seems to be pushing ahead anyway, almost like it's taking up the steam that BRI left behind.
It has become a competition. I mean, I think
Right.
it's inevitably going to simply increase as a competition. As China attempts to build goodwill and basically saying we are going to give X amount of the Sinopharm vaccine, et cetera, to countries free of charge. Here in Cambodia, we've already, just about a week and a half ago, we had the announcement that China would give Cambodia 1 million doses of this vaccine, but the efficacy rate is much lower. And we've seen numbers across a wide variety of countries of different trials. I think the lowest we saw was around a 52% efficacy rate in Brazil. Now, I'm a political economist rather than an epidemiologist or a virologist, but there does seem to be at least some degree of consensus that the efficacies of the different vaccines are quite extensive. That there is a gap there. But at the same time, we've also seen countries in the global south. We saw South Africa just this week saying there is a huge gap between the higher developed OECD states
Right.
and less developed countries. And at that stage, China is really responding to a very significant demand.
Right.
We're starting to see estimates come out already as to when certain countries will have their vaccinations completed, if all goes to plan. And of course, we know with COVID so far, nothing has gone to plan. But the United Kingdom, the United States, looking at late July, early August, to have herd immunity, assuming that vaccination rates continue at the upward pace they're climbing. But for other less developed countries, people are looking at late 2022, even in some cases seeing numbers 2023.
Right.
So there is a huge demand as vaccinations massively speed up for a vaccine, even if it happens to be one that's less effective.
It's also a lot easier for China to sound generous. I mean, a lot of this is a battle for perceptions and it's public relations to a point. But it's very easy for the Chinese to be generous when Britain and the United States are enduring some of the greatest outbreaks of as a community disease with COVID-19 that they have in the last few months. I mean, it's and the elections. The Chinese are actually they're in a good spot.
Comparatively speaking, relatively yes. The U.S. is with the new Biden administration, and everyone's wondering, well, what is the new Biden administration's approach going to be towards Southeast Asia, et cetera, towards Africa, towards wherever? And the reality is everyone's going to have to wait.
Right.
The U.S. requires hundreds and hundreds of political appointments to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and at this point in time, Washington is entirely focused on COVID.
Right.
And COVID mitigation. China has had some new outbreaks, some new local outbreaks across the country, but relatively small. And the GDP growth numbers we're seeing out of China shows very strong recovery, and that this is moving forward quite positively. So China is in a position where it's able to take advantage of that, where the U.S. and the U.K. in particular, and now really all of Europe, and Australia are essentially focusing on what's going on back home. Their governments know that, there is massive anti-China sentiment increasingly in the West, but the voting issue is going to be COVID, especially as people spend day after day after day in lockdown.
Indeed. Now, taking it back again, in a post-COVID world, if that's possible to imagine, as you were saying earlier, the whole BRI is going to change supply chains going forward. How do you see that evolving, particularly the supply chains themselves around the region and the different economic zones that were opening up?
Well, we're seeing with particularly here in Southeast Asia, what we have seen is the level of infrastructure development has been quite significant, and no one can deny that there has been an infrastructure funding gap. At the same time, the trade war really indicated to suppliers, to firms, et cetera, that relying entirely on China is simply not the best idea. That this is looking at the implications from the Trump trade war. And now with the new RCEP agreement and the idea of, okay, well, if you want to produce for China, you can produce in Southeast Asia. and do those exports. But one thing that is quite also positive, I think, for Southeast Asia is while the Biden administration is certainly going to avoid the tactics of the Trump administration, we're not seeing any sort of this is a return to the sort of almost fantasy-like status quo ante that people view the Obama administration as with regard to China relations. It's vital to recognize that the Asia pivot took place during the Obama administration.
Sure, it was a bit late.
It was late, but it was there, and we've seen a generational change in a lot of the personnel who serve in career government, who have a much more negative view of China than their predecessors. Even in the field of China studies, we've seen something of a generational shift. Mm-hmm. So post the implications of all of this for Southeast Asia on the United States is it's still going to be highly incentivized as a place to put your production, as opposed to China. This should continue the benefits for countries that we've seen, especially places like Vietnam.
Well, it's funny. I was just going to suggest that who will win the trade war between China and the United States? Or Vietnam.
Vietnam and Mexico. Vietnam and Mexico. It's been a great couple of years.
Right.
And I think at the same time this week we've seen the question is everyone's is this time the U.S. will re-engage with China, et cetera. We saw the statement from the White House press secretary saying we see China, this is a fundamental issue of strategic competition. Beijing attempted to frame its approach to the United States as extending an olive branch, making a rather undiplomatic statement of we hope that the U.S. will learn from the errors of the Trump policy, of course spoken by the spokesperson from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, who's really become a figure of widespread unpopularity among many folks. And this, of course, didn't go well. The new U.S. trade representative has basically said, hey, this is not over, and we are going to be moving forward with protecting intellectual property and so on and so forth. Now, the U.S. would do that globally. Mm-hmm. So it's the Trump tactics are over, but the U.S. approach to China has fundamentally shifted. We're not in an era of full containment. I always like to use the term that was coined a couple of years ago by someone of where it's a mix. It's the U.S. it's a mix of containment and engagement. It is con-gagement. Right. Where previously, since really China's WTO entry, the U.S. was in a full engagement mode. But increasingly there is the widespread view in the United States. Obviously there are divisions, but that model failed. That was much overly optimistic.
It might. I don't want to sound. I certainly don't want to sound too nasty, but was it a mistake to let China into the WTO?
I think at the time, and this goes to sort of how China had framed itself. And in the 90s, China constantly framed itself as a responsible power, talking about China's peaceful rise. Mm. And China had continued legacy goodwill. Remember, as a U.S. and Western ally against the Soviet Union, despite the events of Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen 89, and that halted economic reform, which then re-begins in 1993. And we see, all right, this idea, this very post-war naive optimism that everyone following Francis Fukuyama's famous book, The End of History, that the time had come. Every country was simply going to become a liberal democracy and engage in market capitalism, and that was the end. And this was the belief system that was
skipping
held.
hand in hand off into the sunset.
Exactly, and everyone just sort of, and you could sort of, in a post-Cold War context, after decades of fear of nuclear annihilation, I mean, one can forgive some folks for being overly optimistic. But it was, of course, Bill Clinton at the WTO signing when China was brought in, who said that, China's values will come closer to America's values. And obviously, in a state that is engaged in certain policies in Xinjiang, that's developed a remarkably unique hybrid of neo-totalitarianism, taking state control to levels that have never been seen simply because of the lack of technological feasibility. And I believe that it fits the technical definition. We hear the word fascism very often these days. We hear it applied to Western politicians that we don't like. But look, there is a technical literature on what fascism is. Right. And China's approach towards its ethnic minority groups, this position of just perpetual forcing of China's minority groups into you will speak Chinese, you will be Chinese, etc. You will forego religion, you will forego traditional language. And of course, we saw this with the Uyghurs for decades in Xinjiang, and of course, we've seen it for decades in Tibet as well. One of the most remarkable warning signs last year was when we began to see this applied to the ethnic Korean population in the northeast of China.
Tell me a bit more about that.
This population in the provinces of Liaoning and Jilin, along the border with North Korea, traditionally, have been there for centuries, and no longer use of Korean language. It's time to switch out of using Korean. It's time to get to Mandarin. We see a similar approach to the Mongol population of Inner Mongolia, and neither of these groups are remotely a security threat.
Remember 20 years ago, if you traveled to Guangdong, and from Shenzhen to Guangdong, they all still spoke Cantonese, and that's all gone now. There's a lot happening in Hong Kong, but the Cantonese are very protective of their language.
You start wondering what the future of Hong Kong is going to be. When London announced earlier this week that there are I think the total is something like over 5 million people in Hong Kong who qualify or are dependents of those who qualify for British national overseas passports, which London said, congratulations, that means 5 years of residency in Britain and eventually British citizenship. There's only 7 million or so people in Hong Kong.
That's right.
What is Hong Kong without those 5 million people? It's simply another Shanghai.
And they're quite wealthy.
Very much so. It's a huge, huge boon to the United Kingdom to bring those folks in.
And I noticed yesterday that the Beijing has said it's not going to recognise the special British passports, the BNOs that were issued back in '97.
They have announced it, and it's a question of what is London going to do next? What are the actual procedures of, okay, you don't recognise that, but if you still, BNO passport holders also generally have Hong Kong special administrative region. Will they begin to require exit visas?
That's right.
There's a huge amount that Beijing can do.
I just can't remember where countries were told we're not going to recognise your passport, albeit that Hong Kong is not a country, but still, it seems quite extreme.
China's at this stage has clearly moved in a position where there is no time for the UK-China treaty on Hong Kong handover. That's been blown out of the water.
No, they broke it.
And Britain's been completely correct in stating that, okay, we're going to do this because we feel that the treaty commitments you made have not been respected. But no, in the post-Cold War era, I can't think of a context where we've seen something like this happen. This is really a bold step by China, and Beijing doesn't seem to be fully cognizant of the consequences. Despite, there's a ton of smart folks who work at the State Council, who work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, very well trained experts, and I would assume are sort of quietly screaming, knowing that these actions are killing China's already very limited soft power. China is not a state, except for money, that really draws in foreigners.
On that note, and we're starting to run out of time, unfortunately, has China taken on too much? In the sense that, the Middle Kingdom, the way it sees itself from a cartographer's perspective, north, south, east, and west. We're in the south. We're south of China in Cambodia, but we're seeing similar ramifications from their influence. So the north, east, west. Have they taken on too much?
I think BRI is the perfect example of China taking on too much. That we saw some shifts during the period of President Hu Jintao, and then really extreme changes in Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping. And under President Xi, he famously ignored Deng Xiaoping's advice of bide your time, wait. And decided now is the time, that China was ready to take on this huge role, and that China could do BRI, that China could finally find its place in the sun under his leadership. Unfortunately for President Xi, he was about a decade too early.
Right.
And made some very significant mistakes that have resulted in the massive pushback. And looking at relationships that just a year to 2 years ago, we could not have possibly expected would be where they are. Looking at the Quad, for example, the minilateral group of countries, Japan, the United States, India and Australia, and consolidating heavily Indian and Australian opposition.
That's quite
to
something,
China.
and with Indonesia as
So
well.
quickly, 2 years ago, you'd
Yeah.
be at a conference, and we'd hear folks, our colleagues from Australia and from India, who would always be very measured in their tone with regard to China. That period is officially over, and it's shocking to see the missteps. In my view, the biggest one, of course, is I mean, BRI is a clear case, but nothing really beats for the biggest political error of the last decade. Really, is the conflict with India.
And finally, where does that leave Cambodia and the smaller countries of the region, or particularly Cambodia? It's a great example of a small regional country that's struggling but has improved over the years.
Cambodia has grown and is developed by leaps and bounds. I mean, you and I have both spent decades in Cambodia,
Yeah.
and it's a different planet in terms of its development levels. It can't be denied that Cambodia has been a success across so many indicators, the Millennium Development Goals and so on, and now the SDGs. At the same time, Cambodia has leaned heavily towards one side. While there's an official view of multilateralism and working with all, it's the overwhelming view is that Cambodia is China's primary ally in Southeast Asia. The question really is has Cambodia gone so far that it can't be brought back to a safer, multilateral, fully engaging policy, not leaning too heavily to one side? And that's a question that we're going to see the answer to in the next couple of years, dependent on a wide variety of factors. I think one of the most important that we'll see as the Chinese population returns to Cambodia is the development of Cambodian nationalism, which increasingly, as I've argued in other places, is increasingly defined against China as the other against which Cambodian identity is defined, where historically it was Vietnam and Thailand, now it's China. Things have tamped down in terms of anti-Chinese sentiment because the Chinese, sort of to bookend and go back to where we began, simply aren't here right now. But should we see the flood and return again, there's some challenges there. And how that's dealt with is going to really be definitive as to where Cambodia heads.
And on that note, Bradley Merg, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke.